A participatory economy uses indicative prices. What does that mean? How does that work? How is it different from prices in other economies? We'll talk about that and more on this episode of PEP Talk.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Hello and welcome to PEP Talk, the Participatory Economy Podcast, the podcast where we discuss the democratic alternative to capitalism known as a participatory economy. I'm your host, Mitchell Szczepanczyk, coming to you from Chicago. I'm joined by two guests today. In this episode, we're joined by Robin Hahnel. Robin, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you.
And joining us from Helsinki, Finland, is Antti Jauhiainen. Antti, welcome to the show.
Thanks. You're getting better and better at pronouncing my name.
Thank you. It's like we've been doing this a while, so I like to think I'm getting some practice in. Good.
Yeah, but I still can't pronounce your name, Mitchell.
Yeah.
So
now you got to work on mine. That's why I'm the host. It's just like no one can pronounce his last name. Make him the host. Sure. Anyway, changing topics briefly, we'll talk about the intended topic of this episode, which is about prices, particularly the version of prices that a participatory economy has, which are called indicative prices. Robin, let's start with you. Let's talk a little bit about some foundational stuff. So they're called indicative prices. Talk a little bit about the basics regarding that. What are they? How do they work? Why did you give it the name indicative prices? Expound on some basics, please.
Okay. Well, in the model of a participatory economy, we have to generate information that people then have available when they are making decisions about what they want to propose to do, whether it's propose to produce something or propose to consume something. And what to call them, is it's actually kind of an important choice we discovered. Because as soon as you call something a price, there are some people whose reaction is, I already don't like this. Like the dominant reaction, for people who are anti-capitalist, for people who are on the left, for people who are very upset about the terrible way that neoliberal economies are operating in the world today, you mentioned the word prices and they just want to run for the exits. They want people to just interact with one another personally. They want people to communicate, talk, and then come to sensible decisions after just, hearing what others have to say. This is all very understandable. I mean, it's a very understandable reaction. It's very similar. I think it was Oscar Wilde, who had this wonderful quip that capitalism knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. Mm-hmm. So there's a huge emotional reaction, which I think is understandable that people have to the subject. On the other hand, for people to make sensible decisions, for people even to decide what they want to do, much less decide whether they give their approval for others to do things that they want to do. I think you have to have, in a large economy, you have to have information about what does it cost to produce different things. And one name for those things is prices. So we use the word indicative prices, and I kind of wish we hadn't. I wish we had just talked about opportunity costs, social costs of producing things, social rate of returns on investments. If we'd used those phrases, at least we wouldn't be running into this immediate emotional obstacle that, these people just care about prices. I know historically why we chose the term indicative prices. We meant the word indicative to mean we understand they are not ever going to be perfect measures of all the ways and the degrees to which different things cost us and society to make available. So indicative was meant to sort of signal, we're not claiming these are perfect measures. On the other hand, generating reasonably accurate and the most accurate estimates of what it costs to make things. What kind of cost? Well, the hours of work that it takes to make things. That's something that Marxists always understood was sort of part of what goes into prices. But it's not just the hours, of work it takes. It's also how much of scarce inputs from the natural environment. So there are a whole bunch of things besides labor costs that go into the things we should be taking into account when we make decisions. And so that's what our argument is. You need a system you need to design an economic system that will generate reasonably accurate estimates of what it truly costs in any and all ways for society to make things available for people to use. And people need that information in order to even decide what they think it's fair for them to do, what I think it's fair for myself to do. How do I know whether I should go out and consume a bunch of things until I know, well, how much did that really cost everybody else? And how much in terms of environmental resources did that use up? I need that information to know whether my own consumption proposal, is something that I think is socially responsible. And of course, if we also are going to have a system of people have to agree about what others are proposing to do, I need to know that information in order to evaluate others' proposals and, importantly, do it quickly. So that's where all of this comes from. But it's a real hornet's nest on the left. There's just absolutely no doubt about that.
Yeah. Antti, you wanted to enter the discussion here? What do you think?
Yeah, and I entered the fray.
Yeah, fray. I stopped myself.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the thing is that the alternative of democratic planning of the economy is so rare, so little known, that the only two possibilities that people have for prices is either capitalism markets, which left often associates with prices, or then something like what Oscar Lang promoted, which is centrally planned, and the whole idea of centrally planned economy and experts formulating prices, having some sort of very nuanced mechanism that allows the central planners to plan the economy. And if those two are the only options, then basically what's left for leftists is just to be skeptical of prices, because I think smart leftists understand the inherent problems of capitalism, but also the inherent problems of centrally planned economy. And after that, there's nothing left except, vaguely point towards democracy. And that's where, what Robin said, that everyone just, negotiates and somehow, finds mutual acceptance, and then we don't need prices. But I think that's a very flawed category, and I think that's why we definitely should have a discussion about prices in future non-capitalist economy.
Right. I'm wondering if maybe Robin touched on this a little bit. I'm wondering if maybe the term, we should just simply replace the word prices with costs from now on in this. I don't think there's any reason why we can't, and it doesn't seem like it really changes anything, certainly not with the model, aside from maybe the name about that. Robin, what do you think of that idea?
That probably is a good idea. I mean, I now wish we had never used the phrase indicative prices. Now, I mean, as an economist, I can tell you that there is a concept that economists use. It's called opportunity cost.
Okay.
So if you have something that's scarce, whether it's labor or fertile land, then there is what economists call an opportunity cost of using it. Because if you use it in one way to produce one thing, well, then you don't have it available to use to produce a different thing.
Right.
And so there are opportunity costs of using the machines. We have so many machines in a factory at a certain point in time. We have so many acres of land. We have so many hours available of skilled welding labor. So if you use it to do one thing, then you can't use it for something else. And that is what economists mean when they say there's the opportunity cost of using that. Another phrase we have is, well, what is the overall cost of producing anything? And the name for that is social cost. And here's an example that's very familiar to everybody. Well, the cost in capitalism, one of the problems has been that the cost of producing something often doesn't include the pollution that the factory generated when it was producing. When we produced automobiles, when we produced steel, we also generated pollution. Well, those are called external costs. So economists say, look, there are two kinds of costs in an economy. One is there's the cost that's actually paid for, and then sometimes there are external costs that are not paid for, and that's a problem because it's inefficient not to take those costs into account. And so for economists, there's the private costs of making something, and then there's also the external costs. And when you add those two together, they say that would be by definition what the social cost is. Well, we clearly want to design an economic system in which there's no separation between the private costs and the social costs. We want to include all the costs, including the costs of pollution, for instance. So economists have these concepts. I mean, we have private costs, we have social costs, we have opportunity costs. And then we have, in terms of investment, we have a social rate of return on investment, which might be different than what the private rate of return on an investment in a capitalist economy. But if it's different, that's the problem. And you want to design an economy that includes that. So I do think we actually have the tools available. The problem is that mainstream economists make a fetish out of all this and annoy the piss out of leftists. The problem is that the leftists react against the annoying part, and particularly react against anybody who tells them that neoliberal capitalist market prices, those are just the right price signals. We know those aren't good signals. The question is, but in a desirable economy, do we need good signals, the right signals, the best approximation we can achieve and generate to the right signals so that human beings can make sensible decisions? And our answer has been yes to that. But frequently, in circles amongst particularly younger people who are coming to be anti-capitalist, who are outraged by, the ridiculous prices in capitalism, and who also, I think, are simply naive about how can lots of people with limited time come to sensible decisions. We can't just talk about everything endlessly until people just come to an agreement without really useful information.
Yeah. Touching on the point that you raised regarding this kind of resistance, especially among people who would otherwise agree on the political left, that actually leads to a kind of thorny question. I don't know what Antti would like to say about this, but I'll probably pose it on a question, or if there's some other thing that you wanted to raise. How do you overcome that kind of resistance among leftists? Antti, do you have any thoughts, or do you want to enter some other discussion on this? What do you think?
Yeah, I can talk about that, and then another point on
Sure.
prices as well. But how to overcome it? Well, I think more and more people are realizing how sort of serious the situation is with climate change and how sort of interconnected the world is. When I was younger, when I was a teenager, I was part of the so-called anti-globalization left, or anti-globalization movement. And that's where I originally came to encountered work, for example, by Robin and Michael Albert, Noam Chomsky, and others. And I remember already then thinking about how sort of maybe due to my sort of sci-fi fandom previously or something, and they always include humanity and Earth Alliance or something that, whole humanity works together, but with technology. And some of the anti-globalization talk always reminded me that this is very localism. This sort of says that they are for, everyone in the world and everything is global, think global, act local, and so on. But all the solutions were very, very local. And I kept thinking, like, how do you get MRI machines out of that? And I think that has we've sort of moved on from that. I think there is more sense nowadays that we really need to build, a global world, a global economy, a global democracy. And I hope that there will be growing sense that it will actually take a long time. And, I think, encouraging that attitude also can help overcome the sort of uneasiness about prices, because that way I think most leftists understand that, whatever they think of prices, they aren't going away anytime soon. We are using prices. And then we have to make them better by different forms, maybe, cap and trade or forms of, taxing capital or moving capital to public hands, whatever. And all of that will affect prices. And that's why it's important to talk about prices. And I think recent talk, about inflation or greedflation or gas prices and so on, is a welcome change that, we are actually talking about prices. I think at least in Finland, there's actually, it's a something that mainstream politicians talk about, that we will, keep the price of gas low or something like that. And it is silly. And it is irresponsible in many ways, because they are, a lot of those right-wing politicians talking about it, disregard climate change way too much. But I think that the thing there is that they are talking about prices. So I think that's a good sign. And that might help overcome. And I think things might be moving towards a better direction in that sense. Another thing I want to mention, again, because this is an episode about prices, and I'm a fan of them, is that I think prices help, because one of the difficult things about working in communities, and especially in a global community and working in an economy, if we want to build a working economy and society that involves lots and lots of people, is what happens when someone says no. And that's often, as an activist, that's what I've seen many times in Occupy movement, or more recently in Extinction Rebellion. That's always very difficult for activists to sort of overcome. They always want everything to be kumbaya and, consensus. And then there's, the powerful, charismatic guy who takes over the situation, and that creates tensions and something like that. And you see this, and then there's a lot of really smart, quiet people who just stay away and are like, this isn't a smart solution, but I'm not going to bother doing anything about this. And I think prices are just so integral for us to avoid. It's the same thing as why having laws is important, that we have a system of, a rule of law, is that when there are situations of conflict, when there are, differing objectives and people aren't agreeing on everything, prices are just so important to that, because that way we can have some sort of, we've agreed on the system for prices, and then we can trust that we work in some manner through that. So I think prices just help us make decisions smarter and more efficiently. We just have to be careful about how to build a system that affects our prices.
And there are and have been efforts to try to incorporate that within current economies. There are a couple of examples I can mention now. One is actually mentioned Occupy Wall Street. The same magazine that came up with the idea of Occupy Wall Street, Adbusters magazine, also has, over the years, they've had various fair pricing campaigns. A couple of years ago, they actually relaunched the campaign that they've called the True Cost campaign, #TrueCost, with the idea of trying to have various goods and mostly the environmental impacts of those goods be reflected in the cost of things. And going through examples, for example, of plastic as one example they had cited about how plastic is not the price of plastic and its use is not reflective of the full environmental impacts about that. It should. And a lot of people say, wow, that's a great idea. Good luck on making that happen. but they're working on it as a campaign. Another effort that's been working on this is an effort called the Global Footprint Network, with what they call the ecological footprint, trying to determine the various ecological impacts that people have in their various consumption matters. Robin, as an economist who's been working on issues related to this for many, many years, what are your thoughts with regards to these particular here and now campaigns to try to adjust prices to bring them more into line regarding those kinds of impacts that like a given market economy wouldn't? What do you think?
I think they're always, the motivation is good and the idea is good. The idea is, well, can we provide people with better information about the true consequences of the choices they're making? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the motivation. And the answer to that is, yeah, that would always be a good idea. I don't know about the Adbusters' actual way of doing their calculations. I know a little bit about the ecological footprint calculations, and they've had a rather big impact in the environmental community. They're rather well known and people pay attention to it. As an economist, when I looked in to see, well, how do they actually do the calculations, I discovered, well, you can't do it that way. This isn't good economics. I would contrast that to, well, in a participatory economy, we've designed procedures so they actually do it right. Send people the reasonably accurate estimates of the consequences, including the environmental impacts, the ecological impacts. But it is any effort that says current neoliberal market prices are off, they're bad signals, they are missed signals, and they lead us to do things that are, demonstrably counterproductive. That is good, and attempts to generate more accurate. In the real world, so some of these efforts are we're just providing people a different set of estimates of what it really costs for them to take into account. Well, then there's also the real policy where, well, we're actually going to, put a tax, on carbon emissions. We're going to put it, or we're going to do a so there are actual policies that the whole point of them is they are designed to correct an inaccurate market signal and change it into a signal that is a more accurate estimate of what it truly is costing us all to do different things. And so those are also, they actually have an impact on what happens in the world, in the here and now, before we have system change. So one is sort of a consciousness raising activity, and that's good if you actually get the things right. And the other is a real policy activity, and that if we get closer to including the actual environmental costs and the prices that people are charged, such as gasoline. Mm-hmm. The price of gasoline, the actual cost of burning a gallon of gasoline is probably 7 to 8 times higher than what we pay to burn, when we put a gallon of gasoline in our tank here in the United States. Europe has always had gas prices that are probably 50 to 100% higher than us, meaning they have come closer to charging what it really costs to burn gasoline than the United States has. And in Mexico, it's even worse, in terms of what you pay for a price of gas. So getting those prices closer is always a good move in the right direction.
Antti, you want to say something?
Yeah, prices are like a systemic matter. So I just want to mention, for example, that planes emit increasing amounts of emissions, and they are completely tax-free due to an agreement made in the 40s. So that's sort of interesting example, like how flawed our price system currently is. But I think part of the discussion is that because fixing prices is such a there's just recently, there was the first, I think, OECD countries made this common joint effort to combat like these tax havens, and to have universally agreed that all countries would agree on corporate tax levels to avoid the kind of skimming that countries do, or companies do, that they choose countries which have the best tax level and make countries compete between one another. And that's, I think, very early step of fixing, like actually systemically taking these problems. And that's, I think that's problematic for a lot of campaigns and a lot of, activists, because you always want to have a positive message. You always want to have, something that we can do now, like calculate your ecological footprint. But actually the problems are really deep and will require, for example, Robin knows this well, and Mitchell has helped Robin with the research, but actually finding mechanisms to find, accurate prices, it's not easy, and it requires a lot of, really systemic analysis. I would love to say, even without opportunity costs, because that's the reality, and you don't do anything with prices if you can't include opportunity costs. So it's something that really I think it requires, but it's a bit difficult topic, I think, and this is why I think a lot of leftist activists avoid it, because it's basically something that requires economics and legal departments and engineers, and it's a really complicated matter. But I think, and I'm no engineer, I'm just primary school teacher and democracy activist. But I think it's still feasible idea that leftists and those concerned about capitalism would just say that we really need to fix prices in long term. We need an economy that has much more accurate prices. And the example we've used with the work of Paricom Finland in here is that, for example, in a working economy, environmentally sustainable products would be cheaper than environmentally harmful products. That's sort of elementary. I think that's something that people can grasp, that, because products create environmental problems, they should be priced, higher, because that's the price to fix those environmental problems. And then it would send people the signal that we don't want to destroy the environment, and it's costly to do so. And currently it works just the other way around, that all environmentally sustainable products are basically very easily very pricey. So that's one. The other thing I think these campaigns lack is talking, discussion about remuneration, because that's also part of prices. Because if you just talk about prices and you don't talk about how much people have sort of voting tickets in the system, then it's a really lopsided discussion.
Right. Following up on your point, Antti, regarding the difficulty of trying to set up a kind of better pricing setup. This is something that Robin and I had actually tried to wrestle with in the book Democratic Economic Planning, where as part of the book, we had written computer simulations of a participatory planning system in an economy that we built from scratch in a computer program. But when it came to the issue of trying to improve the pricing setup that we had built, we had generated prices, and we had them adjusted basically based on the supply and demand of the respective sets of councils, the production councils, the worker councils, and the consumer councils, that adjusted things based on the respective supply and demand, and the price went up or down depending on that surplus, as it's called. But when we tried to improve that to try to bring in environmental impacts, the model just went crazy, and we're just like, I don't know how to do this. We have to postpone this. Robin, you remember this? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, that's right. When we were doing the programming for the simulations, we wanted to incorporate the environmental externalities, and that aspect of taking into account what the true social costs of making things are. And And we ran into technical difficulties in terms of doing the mathematical modeling. And one of the reasons we're still looking for a funder who will help us, wrap this up and make it more compelling is that just proved to be more difficult than we had originally assumed. So it's at the top of my list of things I still want to do to make all that simulation work even more compelling, is to go ahead and realistically take into account our pollution demand revealing mechanism in the planning proposal.
Right.
I mean, I want to just say that here's what it comes down to. You have to make choices. And if you don't want a market economy, now most of the people in the world still think they want a market economy, but there are some on the left who realize what all the problems are with a market-driven system. And so they don't want a market system. And if you're also very clear that you don't want some sort of version of central planning, where there's a planning authority that simply has, and it's the planning authority that has the decision-making power over what's going to be produced and how it's going to be produced, and that just disenfranchises ordinary workers and consumers in too many ways. So if you don't want one of those if you don't want either that or that, what is it you want? And the answer is, well, you want consumers and workers in their workplace. You want them to be able to plan their joint activities together. In order for them to do that sensibly and take into account the amount of time and energy they have to engage in this process, it seems to me that it's absolutely critical for them to have reasonable estimates of social costs and social benefits and opportunity costs of different options. Because unless they have that at their fingertips and can immediately use that to evaluate their own proposals and other people's proposals, they cannot together plan without a central authority to do it for them. So if you don't want a central authority to do it for us all, then you have to make it possible for all of us to do it with one another. And you have to make it possible for us to do that without naivete about how long a discussion would take without information available, critical information, and with a realistic assessment of just how much time people have to sit down and make these decisions and and give their okay for something to happen. And that's where these estimates of opportunity and social cost play a very critical role in making that non-authoritarian planning, non-market option into something that's a realistic possibility.
We're approaching time here, so I would like to give each of you, Antti and Robin, a chance for some final thoughts. Antti, what are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I hope to see more discussion on prices, and that sort of discussion would help acknowledge the sort of short attention span that often plagues the discussion about alternatives to capitalism. That because I think discussing prices is part of moving the discussion away from these magic silver bullet solutions to capitalism, and instead sort of agreeing that it will require a long road of building work towards a non-capitalist economy. The other part of it is that I think a lot of non-leftists have I think very well reasoned criticism of leftist proposals, and I think I hope that discussion about prices might help convince some people that there are sensible projects, sensible ideas to build a non-capitalist economy, and might spark some renewed interest into anti-capitalism or non-capitalist alternatives.
Robin, last words on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think Oscar Wilde was right. Capitalism knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. A participatory economy is going to help us figure out what the value of everything is truly, so that people can rather quickly make sensible decisions amongst ourselves about what it is we agree on.
This has been PEP Talk, the Participatory Economy Podcast, the podcast where we discuss the democratic alternative to capitalism known as participatory economy. To find out more, visit the website of the Participatory Economy Project online at participatoryeconomy.org. There you can find an online newsletter where you can sign up and get monthly updates on matters and issues worked by and from the Participatory Economy Project. There's also an online forum where you can sign up and discuss issues related to a participatory economy, including the matter of prices and costs, as we've been discussing in this episode. For Mitchell in Chicago, Antti in Helsinki, and Robin in Portland, Oregon, thank you for watching or listening. Have a great day.
Have a great day, everybody.
Bye.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Self-management, democratic control of communities or workplaces, federal arrangement.
Participatory democratic planning.
Jobs to have a mix of empowered work, nested councils linked to one another. Everyone gets to participate in a primary council.
Please visit participatory.economy.org to find out more and subscribe to our newsletter. And don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks, and see you at the next episode.